expansive than just the statistics or stories that make news headlines. White supremacy, as we aim to cover in our modified mission statement, is an intricate hierarchy in which systemic prejudice and socialization lead to societal trends, which then make way for the white entitlement that allows for more extreme and overt actions such as violence or insurrection. White supremacy is not simple or one-dimensional. It can be more comprehensively depicted in the form of a pyramid. The occurrences on the top of the pyramid, such as violence, slurs, and extremist groups, are built upon the foundation provided by the concepts on the bottom of the pyramid, which we will cover later. The insurrection on January 6th was a prime example of the top points on this pyramid.
Being at the top of the racial hierarchy, the white insurrectionists were preferred by law enforcement, which was soft in controlling their actions, and were privileged in the sense that they knew they wouldn't be killed on sight upon roaming around the Capitol, stealing objects from offices, looking through desks, and defecating on sight. They knew they were protected by the color of their skin. They had the power to create fear throughout the country by calling for an insurrection, raising questions about the stability of our nation, and creating a worldwide joke of the United States because their extremist actions were insufficiently opposed. If they had been Black, Indigenous, or people of color, their actions would have been seen as dangerous and resulted in incarceration or other punitive action long before they were able to plan and carry out an insurrection. If, hypothetically, they were Black, Indigenous, and people of color and had been able to attempt an insurrection, the insurrectionists would have been shot on sight, and the scandal of an insurrection may have gone much more unnoticed because people of color being killed in our society is too often brushed off as the norm.
Most concerningly, the insurrectionists had the power to invalidly call into question the results of the election and be seen as credible. In a situation where masses of people were denying the presidential election was fair and were making plans to address this perceived injustice, what else could those plans have led up to but an insurrection? Given that, why didn't the FBI act in a manner that anticipated the insurrection and was working to prevent it? This all boils down to one reality. Virtually all of the insurrectionists were white.
In discussing this reality, we have to account for the fact that a few of the insurrectionists were not white. However, the reasons for this are still rooted in white supremacy and its hierarchy based on proximity to whiteness. Whether these insurrectionists felt advocating for white supremacy would insulate them from suffering from it, or would enable them to reach the pinnacle of whiteness that those in our society implicitly and explicitly idealize. White people aren't the only people who perpetuate white supremacy.
Just as there are ways to strengthen white supremacy, such as through power displays like the insurrection, there are also ways to reduce its power over our society through everyday and locally based actions, because white supremacy's foundation rests on the more subtle forms at the bottom of its pyramid.
One example of this is race-based microaggressions, which can include judgmental comments, assumptions, and even stares. Although these forms of perpetuating white supremacy may seem small, they compound over time and can have drastic effects, such as shame regarding heritage and mental health issues. In adopting a resolution declaring racism a public health crisis last June, Princeton's mayor and council acknowledged the reality that racism is debilitating physically, mentally, and emotionally. In people with lupus, studies indicate that experiencing racial discrimination with greater frequency is associated with stronger symptoms and organ damage. Depression is the most frequently reported condition in Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Native Indigenous American adults have the highest reported rate of mental illness out of any group that identifies with one race.
Minimization and indifference are a major part of the everyday racial trauma that taints the quality of life of these individuals. This can come in the form of equivalating someone's experience of racism with a conflict you had with a coworker, or failing to confront racist remarks made by a loved one. Having the option to comfortably stay silent about racist remarks or policies is a prime demonstration of privilege, and over time builds a foundation for the events at the top of the pyramid of white supremacy to occur.
There is no benign white supremacy. Every level on the pyramid contributes to the pyramid. Despite how wildly harmful it is, the fact of the matter is that all Americans buy into white supremacy on some level, whether we're white or not, due to how ingrained it is into our country. We all participate in the pyramid in one way or another, whether it be conscious or unconscious.
The good news is that we can combat and unlearn our systemically rooted habits that manifest as biased thoughts and actions.
The first step to this is knowledge and education. So we hope you've learned something new. Now we're going to discuss how white supremacy plays into our everyday lives.
It is our collective responsibility to be aware of the systemic racism in our country and work to combat it on all levels of the pyramid, as complacency in and of itself is an endorsement. We are going to go through the levels of the pyramid and discuss how we can best learn to combat it on the societal level as well as on the individual level.
Near the pinnacle of the pyramid is violence. The aspects of white supremacy in this category are those we often see in the news stories that many of us have become all too familiar with. These include hate crimes such as lynchings and instances of police brutality. This insidious brand of white supremacy can be confronted with advocacy on a governmental level. Working to combat this involves holding the perpetrators of such crimes accountable. When violence occurs, we should never get to a point where we see it as ordinary. We must continue to spread awareness of hate crimes so that the American people know that violent racism is not a thing of the past. Awareness, condemnation, and legal action should be routine in any instance of violence, as so often we see such brutal racism go unacknowledged and unpursued. In order to prevent these crimes from happening in the first place, we must look to the perpetrator's history. Often the perpetrators of such crimes have shown instances of racism lower down on the pyramid, in which their privilege protected them from previous persecution.
One of the most glaring signs that someone has the potential to commit a hate crime in the future is calls for violence. This is a form of overt and intentional racism, which may consist of threats, displaying Nazi imagery, or of involvement with the KKK or neo-Nazi groups. These groups create terror in minority individuals, and their work must be watched closely by law enforcement so that their actions do not escalate beyond what American society allows as a result of valuing free speech.
Moving further down on the pyramid is discrimination. This section of the pyramid includes actions such as anti-immigration policies, hiring discrimination, and redlining, which means putting services, financial and otherwise, out of reach for residents of certain areas based on race or ethnicity. Discriminatory actions usually stem from implicit bias making its way into our government and positions of power. We can work to combat this by advocating for policy change. This involves educating ourselves on important and current proposed federal or state level policies that affect things like immigration law, housing law, or policing law. Know who your local, state, and federal representatives are so that you can make your voice heard while new laws are being considered. Before any election, whether it be on the local, state, or federal level, educate yourself about the candidates' histories and proposed changes, and look for specific plans and knowledge of the systems and practices that uphold racism in order to choose the candidates that are most prepared and motivated to implement anti-racist policy.
Below discrimination on the pyramid is veiled racism. Prime examples of veiled racism are victim blaming, racist jokes, and tone policing. Actions that fall on this level of the pyramid are quite common in our society, yet they are often overlooked and downplayed. These acts are usually driven by individual implicit bias, and we have a tendency to rationalize them. Because of this, in order to work on combating this, one must look inwards to examine their own racial bias. Everyone brought up in our society has biases. They are unavoidable, and the first step towards dismantling them is acknowledgement. By knowing that our biases exist, we can look out for instances when we notice them and can make intentional corrections. The first thought that goes through your mind is what you have been conditioned to think. What you think next defines who you are. We must pay attention to our first thought, our initial reactions and biases, and question that thought pattern before we allow our actions to reflect the biases that we have been taught. Over time, we can work to rewire our initial biases and rewrite the script that our socialization has provided for us. In addition to working on our own personal biases, it is also important to call others out when we notice bias in their words or actions, which we will talk more about shortly.
Towards the bottom of the pyramid is minimization. Examples of minimization include denying white privilege or dismissing microaggressions with phrases like, "it was just a joke." Minimization is often caused by an unawareness of the severity of offensive actions or microaggressions, in which people view such occurrences as small or isolated incidences and that people should just get over it. In truth, a racist action, no matter how small it may seem, is not a joke and it should not be dismissed or seen as trivial. Every microaggression contributes to a larger societal prejudice that favors white people over people of color. Working against racism at this level of the pyramid also involves rewiring our biases and standing up for ourselves and others when we encounter racism in our daily lives. A drive to do this can be reinforced by anti-racism training within workplaces and other spheres of life involving positions of power. In addition, we can work on diversifying the messaging we consume. Think about the media you choose to surround yourself with. Does it include Black, Indigenous, and people of color of all genders, nationalities, abilities, and socioeconomic status? When we only consume content from one demographic, we only hear one side of a story. We should continually be making efforts to diversify the media we consume so that it is representative of a variety of voices and perspectives.
The largest part of the pyramid is indifference. This is one of the most common, everyday aspects of white supremacy, and it is an action that, as a society, we seem to find the most acceptable. Indifference can come in the form of refusing to address issues of race and racism in our community, at the risk of getting political. Usually, it appears in the form of noticing racist comments or microaggressions made by peers, coworkers, or even loved ones that we make the decision not to address despite a feeling of uneasiness about what was said. Confronting people in these situations can feel awkward, but we encourage you to speak up. This can be as simple as saying that you feel uncomfortable with what was said. Even if you have trouble articulating the reason a certain comment or remark is offensive, if something does not feel right to you, it probably isn't. People may not always be receptive to criticism or change, but speaking up could lay the groundwork for a train of thought that will cause someone to eventually realize the harm in their actions, as well as inspire those around you to have the confidence to confront similar situations.